Um, I think the book is sort of concerned with the problems of modern Korean society, but also just modern society in general, which is reflected in in these three episodes. So there's obviously the problem of animal cruelty, and the problem of dog meat being still legal to consume in South Korea. The episode of the dog is especially apparent with this sort of fact that eating meat is so accepted, and with dog meat in Korea, especially, but also other parts of the world, you know, um, but it's so accepted that this consumption of meat that when someone tries to become vegetarian like Yonghi, it's sort of like it's it's absolutely demonized, and it's really unfair because like with dog meat now people think, oh, well, that's wrong, that's which is a huge contradiction, a huge hugely hypocritical, because it's like they're saying, well, okay, if we draw the line at dog meat, like dog meat is such this it's this brutal thing, but what about all the other meats? And Yongki sort of represents the rejection of this, but this rejection is also sort of what's so frowned upon because it's so normalized, like with the dinner scene in the first episode, where all the other ladies sort of think, oh, it's okay to be vegetarian if you're trying to lose weight. But if you're being vegetarian, for like a moral cause, then it's like, well, okay, well, that's wrong. And, some of the other things, I also think it presents sort of the impossible beauty standards, and just standards for life in general. So Mr. Chong sees his wife as this incredibly plain person, right? Walking neither fast or slow, which is like, okay, well, what do you want her to do? Like he finds it just so boring. And he also finds his own work boring. He sees his life as boring. Everything about, everything he does is it's just not up to par. It's just this really boring, really sort of horrible thing. Um, which I think the problem reflected here is sort of the superficiality of society, which is, I guess, especially pertinent in Korea, which is famous for its sort of its measuring of people based on these really superficial things. The consumer culture there, and sort of the culture around just making your life look as good as possible. And the same with plastic surgery and stuff like that. All of it is about living a life that is heightened and artificial to the point where it's so entrenched in society and in the psyche of a nation that which is unachievable for most people, that basically everyone in society feels that they're living a life like below everyone else. Everyone feels that they're living a subpar kind of life, even though in reality, life is this beautiful thing. Uh, and it's this, yeah, but it's these impossible standards that crush everything and cause, sort of this dissatisfaction in life that we see with characters like Mr. Chop. There's also the obvious sort of note of the objectification of women, which is seen, not only in the first but the second episode, especially when the brother-in-law sort of turns Yonghee into this object of sexual pleasure. He doesn't love her, and he notes how he never really saw her as sort of lovable or like as a romantic thing anyway in the past, but only now when he knows that she has this Mongolian mark on her body, that he suddenly feels this sexual attraction to her. And obviously, this mirrors sort of the objectification and categorization of women through social media, but also pornography and the sort of toxic culture around that, where women become sort of these hated objects by men. They also become these objects of sexual gratification. You know, um, like yeah, like on social media now, you'll see sort of all these things where like people become objectified, but also for this male gaze. And finally, there's the problem of the toxic work culture and the difficulty of raising a child in modern society. And he works as hard as possible, as hard as you possibly can. But the pressures of modern living means it becomes incredibly straining. This is exacerbated by her husband's departure and the breakdown of this traditional family as and his parents reject her. And so, I think there's this problem of sort of traditional values in a modern world that's kind of reflected in all this. Like Yonghi's father represents the sort of tradition of the past Korea. He's this tough military man, a product of his time. His daughter's rejection of his values, however, and her disapproval of eating meat manifests physically in him hitting her. It represents the literal conflict of society, where in a rapidly changing world, many traditional values have remained, but left their physical scars on modern society, making it impossible to move forward. As for the symbolism of Yonghi turning into a tree, the end of the tree is like green fire, like a massive beast, suggests perhaps the estrangement of people from the natural world. I argue Yonghi turning into a tree represents her fidelity to the natural world through her actions, which become incredibly strange in lieu of the distortion and bastardization of life that is modern society. By turning into a tree, Yonghi sort of represents this force of, obviously returning to nature, obviously, like, literally, and sort of living a life that is perhaps more authentic to what humans are supposed to live compared to this, really heightened artificial sort of modern life that's all about presenting yourself as, as everything is good, as presenting, as doing literally what everyone else is doing, in order to get a sense of normalcy. Um, and so perhaps I think the trees then at the end, going off of this, is that perhaps to Enhi, who sees these trees as like green fire and like a wild beast, is that perhaps life in modern society has become so unbelievably distorted beyond comprehension that Enhi can only see it as this strange and dangerous thing because she no longer recognizes nature and she no longer recognizes this sort of natural life for what it is. Like she can only look at nature and look at vegetarianism as this strange thing because she has embodied, and with all the other characters in the story, they have all, embodied all these values of this modern society that have been entrenched into them through tradition to the point where they don't question anything. And when somebody does begin to question and to contradict and to make them sort of think about their values, they begin to think it's so strange that they reject her. Yonhee becomes this sort of this strange thing. And so in this sense, perhaps Yonhee is sort of like a martyr for like a martyr for change in the fact that when she becomes a tree, perhaps she sort of by becoming a tree, is sort of saying like fuck you to like the sort of established kind of system, all these established traditions, and this sort of horrible life, horrible society that's come about in Korea and in the rest of the world. But that's sort of my analysis, and that's my feelings on the book. I think it was a great book. There were parts of it, especially in the second episode, where I was like, "Wow, this is like reading smut. Like this is some very visceral, very sexual scenes." Um, obviously, I think it's a book that's also it goes into a lot of dark themes. I think it's not necessarily, you know, like a book I would recommend to everyone. It's not just like, oh, pick it up, blah blah blah. I think you have to go into it with an open mind, and I think you have to go into it, like sort of ready to confront some things that might be sort of unnatural and be kind of confronting. But yeah, it's a good book. If you're interested, it's got my stamp of approval. Sort of the story is split into three episodes, which revolve around the central character Young-hee, who becomes a vegetarian. The first episode takes place through the eyes of her husband, Mr. Chung. In the second one, through her brother-in-law, um, her sister's husband, In-hai. And then lastly, the third episode is her sister, In-hai's perspective. And so immediately in the first episode, we're introduced to, it sets the stage. We're introduced to the characters, Young-hee and Mr. Chong. And from the start, we see that Mr. Chong sort of sees Young-hee, his wife, as sort of the most normal, most boring kind of thing. He is this sort of very annoying kind of grating character, where he just sort of he's just so fed up with his wife. He just thinks she's just okay. He lives his life. He says that he only picked the job he did because his grades are really average. He lived his life really averagely, and so his sort of punishment is that he gets like a really average wife, really average by his standards. And the only thing that he really appreciates about her is her cooking. And so he doesn't really appreciate her because, and he marries her only for her plainness, to fill a need. And so there's sort of this build up where one day Young Hee basically just decides, right, that's it. Like one day it's like I'm just gonna become vegetarian. She throws out all the meat from the fridge, which triggers Mr. Chung obviously. Um, it's I mean even if he wasn't sort of a dick, that would still be kind of annoying if someone threw all the meat out the fridge. And at first he's annoyed, but he doesn't see it as too bad of a thing. Like she's throwing some stuff out the fridge. Okay, so what? But then it gets worse as she grows skinnier and skinnier as she's not eating enough. She's not only eating vegetables, but she's also just not eating that much in general. And it's sort of this builds up and sort of manifests when they go out to dinner on a business dinner with Mr. Chung's co-workers one day, where she rejects any meat. She basically just, she sits there and she says, "Nope, I won't touch anything," much to the dismay of many of the other coworkers who thinks, she's being so dramatic. Oh, she won't eat meat. Oh, she's so silly. At first, it's actually not that bad, and they say, "Oh, she's probably just on a diet." It's like she's on the vegetarian diet. That's not that bad. But when she can't provide really an explanation for why she doesn't eat meat, then it becomes weird and people start really looking at her, which I thought was a really interesting contradiction. It's this thing that, if there's a way to explain it, like, oh, I'm vegetarian because I want to lose weight, something that's sort of accepted as morally and societally acceptable, then they sort of give her the pass. But when she can't provide an answer, when she can't explain why she feels that she wants to, like, she doesn't know why she wants to be vegetarian, only that feels right to her. That they sort of start sort of getting weirded out. And this gets worse and worse as she, loses more weight. This sort of all builds up when it builds up to the climax where um one day Mr. Chong calls her parents and he's like, guys, I can't deal with this anymore. Yonghi won't eat any meat, and this is ridiculous. She's just becoming really like just annoying, and this is I can't. And so they have this meetup. The whole family meets up, and then her father, who's this sort of old school kind of traditional military man, gets sort of pushed to the brink. Originally, he's like, "Oh, come on, just eat your meat. Not that bad. It's meat. Like you've been eating this your whole life." And she gets pushed to the absolute brink where she goes, "No, no, 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 no. I don't want to eat meat." Like, and then so he tries to force her to eat meat. He takes the meat and he starts like, he's like, open the mouth, and she won't. And so, and then he basically just proceeds to slap the shit out of her. And he goes, and he slaps and like she smacks her, and so it's like she's bleached, like coughing up blood. And everyone's like, "Oh my gosh, this is hard. Like you can't. What are you doing?" But like Yonghi's father somehow feels vindicated in what he's doing, and like sort of basically abusing Yonghi, saying that, "Oh well, it's because you won't eat meat. That's the problem." And so she gets rushed to the hospital, and that's basically episode one. But this part it's also interesting because it's the only part of the story where we actually see Yonghi's point of view. It's sort of occurs in these like fragmented little sections within the episode, um, where she kind of it gets italicized so you can tell it's her. And originally it's this sort of really kind of all over the place kind of fragmented stream of consciousness type of thing where she's like, oh, oh, meat, it's gross. Oh, I need to eat vegetables. I don't know why I feel about this. Blah blah blah. It's a dream. why, well, why am I having this dream? It's a sort of really fragmented kind of, thing, which it feels like her mind's kind of falling apart. But there is this sort of moment of soberness in her, in her dream, where she flashes back to her childhood, and there's this one sort of disturbing scene where she is bitten by a dog, and so as a punishment, the dog is attached to the back of father's motorcycle and forced to follow it, trailing along behind it until it eventually coughs up blood from exhaustion and eventually dies because her father said that it's good to sort of eat the dog that bites you to like get healed. They then cooks it and also makes the meat tender. They eat the dog, and then she remembers it being weird, but she just sort of eats it because she doesn't really think anything else of it, and she eats a whole bowl. And so episode two takes sort of a detour from that and follows Yonghee's brother-in-law, who suddenly falls madly in love with Yonghee. He doesn't fall in love with her, however. Rather, he falls in love with this blue Mongolian mark on her body, which is like sort of like a baby mark. Which just like it gives him a stubby, to think about it. He puts off everything and he sinks deep into his work, developing this obsession with Yonghee and her body specifically. He uses the excuse of this artistic project to call her in and paint flowers on her body. However, this obsession eventually develops into a desire to see her being penetrated by a man. That man, although he sort of rejects it from a psychological point, that man is himself, who he tries to mirror in the body of another person. So he initially gets this guy Jay, who's another artist at the studio he's at, to come and take pictures of Yonghi. He paints him with flowers, does the same thing. It's all a ruse, so he can basically get close to Yonki and see her naked body and see the Mongolian mark. Although just seeing it's not enough. He eventually asks, the already sort of uncomfortable Jay, who's getting naked with this random woman he doesn't know, to penetrate her. And Jay, for obvious reasons, becomes flustered and angry. He asks, he says, are you trying to make me film like a bad porno? Like, what are you doing? But like he like leaves, and then jumping on the because basically what happens is Yonghee basically, when he's painted in flowers, Yonghee basically she has no resistance to the fact that when he that her brother-in-law says, "Oh, okay," well, tells Jay to penetrate her. She's not, you know, too mad about it, and so her brother-in-law sees this as kind of like, "Oh, well, she wants it," and so he wants to try and do it, but then she pushes him away, and he kind of asks, he's like, "Why?" And she says basically, "Well, you're not covered in flowers. I was attracted to the flowers, not to him." And so he gets his friend, this ex, to paint him, you know, and then to do it with her. And then he comes in the middle of the night and he comes in and they do it. Although she's still sort of reluctant, but she doesn't sort of immediately kind of get mad and blah blah blah. But they eventually, this sort of tryst, it's not really, it's quite one-sided. Um, is eventually ends when Inhai comes in the morning to check on her sister and catches her husband. And so what happens is her brother-in-law tries to kill himself by throwing himself off a building like a bird, but he fails and is taken away by police. And that's the third episode. And then episode three follows Inhai. She tries to take care of her younger sister and get her life together after it falls apart. She sort of is in this melancholy at having lost everyone close to her in her effort to, take care of her sister, but also to take care of everybody because she's sort of the one who tries to keep the family together. Although this actually eventually leads to sort of everyone getting away from her. Her family has ostracized her and her sister. Her husband has left after their husband isn't, the incident together, and Yonghi barely even recognizes her. After, at this point, she's become institutionalized in a mental institution for her, her manic vegetarianism, which has evolved into this sort of, into just not eating basically. And she's also responsible for taking care of her son Jiwoo, who is neglected by his father. By this point, Young-hee reaches a point of no return, where she's so emaciated, it's as if she's barely alive. She attempts to do handstands after communicating with the trees, attempting to become one with nature. She says that, she's talked to the trees and sort of their hands are actually in their roots, which sort of go down. And they have an episode where she sort of kind of she stands in the rain, like, trying to become a tree, which puts everyone in the institution, on alert, and it makes everyone sort of mad. But this section is just sort of it's just in he visiting Young Hee in the hospital. Coming, she tries to bring snacks for her, some of the things that she had when she was a little child. But at this point, Young Hee won't eat anything. She the only way she is alive is the fact that in this really sort of disturbing process that mirrors sort of the force feeding by her father is they get a bunch of these doctors together. They hold Young Hee down and they force food into her through tubes and through needles. They force vitamins into her, and it's this really disturbing process where, it almost kind of feels like it's this sort of sexual kind of penetrative act, the act of sort of force feeding, like just with the meat being force fed by her father, her brother-in-law trying to, force feed her, his thing, and with Inhi, which she tries to get her to eat her, childhood foods, but also the doctors who really like force her to eat until she's bleeding out the mouth. She's already emaciated and she's just bleeding out the mouth.